The town of Willow Creek was small, peaceful, and a little bit forgotten by the world outside. For many years, it had been full of happiness, laughter, and music. People used to meet one another in a special building in the center of town called the town hall. It was not just a building of bricks and wood. It was a place where people danced, sang, argued, cried, and celebrated. It was where the town came alive, but those happy days were gone. Now the town hall looked tired, broken, and empty. Time had changed the town. Many young people left to work in bigger cities. Shops closed one by one. Without events and festivals, the town hall stayed locked most days. No one had money to repair it. The roof leaked when it rained, the windows shook when the wind blew, and the old piano inside sat silent, covered with dust. The building that once echoed with music now gave a sad, lonely sound whenever the door opened. When the government announced that the old building would be sold in an auction, the town felt like it was losing its last piece of history. People gathered outside, reading the notice stuck to the door. Most of them just shook their heads. To them, it was not a surprise. They believed it was only a matter of time. Everything old was disappearing anyway. Why would this be different? The sale of the town hall meant someone rich could buy it, tear it down, and build something modern. Maybe a store, maybe apartments, or maybe nothing for a long time. The people of Willow Creek did not hate progress, but they feared losing the only place that still made them feel like a community. Still, they felt helpless. They had tried to save the building before, but no one had enough money, and no one powerful listened to a small town's complaints. Among the crowd stood Emily Carter, a 30-year-old music teacher who had lived in Willow Creek her whole life. She watched the others reading the notice, their faces full of sadness and acceptance. Emily felt the same sadness, but she did not accept the situation so easily. To her, the town hall was not just an old building. It was a part of her story. It was where she had seen her first concert, where she had learned what music could do, and where she had decided at just 8 years old that she wanted to spend her life teaching others to love music. Every time she passed the building, she remembered sitting on the big wooden chair on stage, feet too short to touch the ground, waiting for her turn to play. She remembered the applause, the bright lights, and her parents smiling proudly. She remembered other children playing, families cheering, flowers being thrown, and laughter filling the air. Long before the world became complicated, this was a place where things felt simple and possible. Emily stood there listening to people talk. Some said it's over, nothing can be done. Some joked that it should have been torn down years ago, some argued about who was to blame, but no one talked about solutions. No one talked about saving it. Everyone seemed to accept defeat before even trying. It wasn't that the people of Willow Creek didn't care, they were just tired. They had watched their town lose piece after piece of its identity. Businesses shut down, jobs moved away, families left. They didn't have the energy to fight another battle. The town hall was the last standing reminder of what the place used to be, but maybe letting it go felt easier than hoping and being disappointed one more time. Emily felt a strange mix of fear and determination. She didn't know how, but she knew she wanted to do something. The town hall mattered, music mattered, community mattered. She believed that saving the building was not only possible, but necessary. But she also knew that people would laugh at her if she said such a thing out loud. They would call her sentimental, foolish, or unrealistic. Still, she could not ignore the feeling growing inside her. It was like the faint sound of a piano note, soft but persistent, refusing to be silenced. The idea of losing the building hurt more than the fear of being laughed at. She felt that if the hall disappeared, something inside the town, maybe even inside every person there, would disappear too. She stood quietly as the crowd slowly walked away, leaving the building behind like a defeated soldier abandoned after the war. Emily did not leave immediately. She walked to the door, ran her fingers across the cold handle, and opened it just enough to peek inside. Dust floated in the air. Light entered through cracks in the wall. The piano stood in its corner, silent but proud, like an old guardian who still believed its purpose was not finished. Emily whispered to herself, more a promise than a thought, "There must be a way." At that moment, she did not have a plan, money, or support. She only had a memory, a dream, and a stubborn belief that something beautiful was still possible. Outside, the town felt hopeless. But inside that dusty hall, standing next to the silent piano, Emily felt the first spark of hope. She didn't know where the journey would lead or how difficult it would be, but she knew one thing for certain. This story wasn't over yet. Emily walked home from the old town hall with memories filling her mind like music she could not stop hearing. The building had been a huge part of her childhood, but she also knew it had been important to the town long before she was even born. It wasn't just a hall, it was a treasure chest full of memories that belonged to everyone. Years ago, Willow Creek had been known as a lively town where people celebrated everything together. Weddings, birthdays, school plays, music recitals, holiday dinners, community meetings, everything happened in that hall. People who had very little still felt rich because they had each other, and they had a place to come together. The building had seen happy times, sad times, and important moments that changed people's lives. Emily often heard old stories from her grandmother. She would talk about the night she met Emily's grandfather at a dance in that hall. She said the room smelled like flowers, the lights were soft, and the music made everyone feel young and free. "I fell in love before the music stopped," she always said with a smile. There were other stories too. During tough winters when roads were closed and people were struggling, the town hall became a shelter. Families gathered there to stay warm, share food, and comfort one another. People brought blankets, soup, and hope. It wasn't just a building. It had been a lifeline. Emily remembered her own first day in the hall. She was 7 years old, tiny and shy, with a small piano book in her hands. The moment she heard someone play the grand piano for the first time, she felt something change inside her. The sound was warm, powerful, and alive. She decided she wanted to learn to make sounds like that. That day was the beginning of her love for music. As she grew older, she spent more and more time in the hall, practicing after school, watching older students perform, and dreaming of one day teaching music herself. She knew she was not the most talented pianist in town, but she loved music with a kind of honesty that made her work harder than anyone else. She believed music was not just about ability, it was about heart. Back then, the hall was full of activity. Children ran around backstage, teachers shouted instructions, parents helped with costumes. Music would drift into the streets, making people stop and smile. There was a sense of connection that made everyone feel like they belonged. But everything changed slowly, like a light fading instead of suddenly turning off. When the economy went down, the town stopped spending money on events. Music programs were cut from schools. Families moved away to find better jobs. The hall was used less and less until it became just an old building people passed without thinking. The grand piano inside suffered the most. It had once been the center of attention, polished and loved. Now it sat in the dark, its surface scratched, its keys yellowed, its strings stretched and weak. Emily always felt sad when she saw it. She imagined it as an old musician with a beautiful voice who had been forgotten. But there was something special about that piano. People used to whisper about it with pride. It was not an ordinary instrument. It had been built by a famous craftsman many years ago, when instruments were made with patience, care, and love. The piano had a unique sound, deep, rich, full of emotion. Musicians who visited the town would say, "This piano doesn't just play music, it tells stories." Even though it was now damaged and forgotten, Emily believed the piano still had something to give. It was one of the reasons she loved the hall so deeply. The two belonged together. The hall gave voice to the piano, and the piano gave life to the hall. Sometimes, when no one was around, Emily would sneak inside, open the dusty lid, and play a few notes. The sound was weaker than before, but still beautiful. It reminded her of a proud old soul refusing to give up. She knew the younger generation didn't understand the history. They never saw the hall filled with people. They never heard the piano at its best. They only saw a broken building and a broken instrument. To them, saving the hall meant saving something useless. But Emily knew better. She knew that places like this mattered. They carried stories, memories, history, and soul. Once destroyed, those things could never be rebuilt. The more she thought about it, the more she felt that losing the hall would be like losing a part of the town's heart. It would mean giving up on everything the community once stood for. People might pretend it didn't matter, but deep down, they knew it did. As Emily walked past the dark building later that week, she imagined the lights turning on again. She pictured a crowd cheering, music filling the air, children laughing, and families hugging. She imagined a future where Willow Creek wasn't just surviving but living again. She didn't know how to make it real. She didn't know where money would come from or who would help. But she knew that if she didn't try, no one would. And so, with memories guiding her and a stubborn dream growing stronger, she promised herself that she would at least fight for the hall. Even if people laughed, even if it seemed impossible, even if she stood alone. Because some things are worth saving not because they are perfect, but because they hold the stories that make us human. A week after the auction notice was posted, the people of Willow Creek gathered in the town library for a community meeting. The room was crowded, and the air felt heavy, like everyone had already accepted defeat but still showed up because it was expected of them. Chairs scraped against the floor, papers rustled, and tired faces looked toward the front where the mayor stood with a serious expression. The mayor explained the situation again, even though everyone already knew it. The town did not have money for repairs. The government was tired of waiting. The building would be sold. Unless, he said, someone can come up with a realistic plan and funding in a very short time. People in the room laughed, not because it was funny, but because the idea was ridiculous. Willow Creek wasn't a place of big miracles. It was a place where people did what they could with what they had, and right now they had nothing. Some suggested turning the hall into a store or renting it to outsiders. Others shrugged and said to let it go. A few people blamed the mayor, blaming years of bad decisions. But most sat quietly, waiting for the meeting to end so they could return to their normal lives. Emily sat near the back listening. Her heart beat faster with every word. She knew she couldn't just sit and watch the hall disappear. She kept thinking about the piano, the stories, the memories, and how wrong it felt to give up without trying. The mayor asked if anyone had ideas. Silence filled the room. No one raised their hand, no one offered hope. Emily felt her stomach twist. She didn't want to stand up. She didn't want everyone staring at her. She didn't want to be judged or mocked. But she also knew that if she stayed quiet now, she would regret it forever. So before she could change her mind, she slowly stood up. Dozens of heads turned toward her. She felt her face get hot and her hands trembled slightly. She cleared her throat and said, "I think I can raise the money to save the hall." For a moment, the room was silent. Then someone snorted. Another person chuckled. A few people laughed out loud, not cruelly but in disbelief. To them, it was like a child saying she could move a mountain with a spoon. Emily continued, trying to keep her voice calm. "I know it sounds impossible, but I have a plan. I believe we can restore the piano, organize performances, invite musicians, and maybe even attract donors from outside the town." More laughter followed, mixed with sarcasm. "You're going to fix the hall with music," someone joked. "Good luck with that," another said. One man muttered, "We need money, not a concert." Emily felt her confidence shrinking, but she didn't sit down. She forced herself to keep going. Music brings people together. It can raise attention, support, and funds. People care about art, history, and culture. If we show them what this place means, maybe they'll help. A woman near the front shook her head. "There is no time for dreams. The auction is in 3 weeks." Emily nodded. "I know, but I want to try." More whispers, more doubtful looks. The mayor raised his hands to quiet the room. "Miss Carter, I respect your passion, but restoring a building and raising that amount of money in 3 weeks is nearly impossible." Emily took a breath and said firmly, "Maybe." But impossible things happen when someone fights for them. Her words did not change the mood. People smiled politely, the way adults smile when a child says something cute but unrealistic. A few younger people looked impressed, but most older residents looked tired, worn down by years of disappointments. One man asked, "Do you have any experience with fundraising?" "No," Emily admitted. "Do you have sponsors?" Another asked, "No." "Do you have money?" someone else shouted. Emily shook her head. "Only ideas." The room erupted in light laughter again, but this time it was kinder, almost sympathetic. They weren't laughing at her, they were laughing at how hopeless the situation seemed. Emily felt embarrassed, but she did not back down. She lifted her chin and said, "I don't expect you to believe in me right now, but I believe in this hall. And I believe we can save it if we at least try." No one responded, some looked away, some shrugged. The mayor sighed. "If you want to try, we won't stop you, but I cannot promise support. The town's budget is empty." Emily nodded. "I understand." The mayor paused, then added gently, "I hope you prove us wrong." The meeting ended soon after. People stood up, grabbed their coats, and headed home, shaking their heads. A few patted Emily on the shoulder as they passed. "Nice idea, dear, but it's too late. You've got heart, but not enough times. Try if you want, but don't get your hopes up." Emily smiled politely, but inside she felt a mixture of hurt and determination. She had expected laughter, but not this much of it. She had expected disbelief, but not the overwhelming sense of resignation in the room. Still, she refused to let the laughter stop her. She walked out of the library into the cool night air, her heart pounding but her mind clearer than ever. Everyone thought she was foolish. Everyone thought she would fail. Everyone thought the hall was already lost. But Emily knew something they didn't. Sometimes the only person who needs to believe is the one who is willing to stand up when everyone else sits down. She walked home whispering to herself, "I meant what I said. I can save it." The night did not answer, but the promise felt real. After the community meeting, Emily spent several days feeling both scared and excited. People had laughed at her, but she hadn't changed her mind. She knew the hall could be saved, but she also knew that believing wasn't enough. She needed a real solution. She did not have money, she did not have sponsors, and she did not have time. What she did have, however, was the old piano sitting silently inside the hall, waiting like a forgotten friend. One morning, she went to the town hall with a set of keys she still kept from when she used to practice there. The door made a long creaking sound as she pushed it open. Dust floated in the sunlight and the air smelled old, like wood and memories. For a moment, she simply stood there, listening to the silence. It was peaceful but also painful because the silence reminded her of how much had been lost. She walked across the creaking floor toward the piano, which stood exactly where it always had, as if guarding the room. The black paint was chipped, and the once bright ivory keys had turned yellow. She gently lifted the heavy lid and pressed a key. The sound was weak and dull but still recognizable. She pressed another, then another. Each note felt like a faint voice calling from the past. Emily wondered how an instrument so beautiful and meaningful had ended up abandoned. She sat on the old wooden bench and began to play a soft melody. The piano responded shakily, like someone trying to speak after years of silence. Even damaged, it still held a kind of magic. Emily closed her eyes and imagined the way it used to sound, rich, powerful, full of life. She played for a few minutes, then stopped when she heard footsteps at the door. Startled, she turned around and saw an elderly man leaning on his cane, watching her with interest. His name was Mr. Harper, a retired historian who had lived in Willow Creek his whole life. People said he knew more about the town than any book did. "I haven't heard that piano in years," he said, walking slowly toward her. "I don't think anyone has played it in a long time," Emily replied. Mr. Harper examined the piano with a thoughtful look. "This old thing has quite a story. Did you ever learn about it?" Emily shook her head. "I know it was special, but I never learned why." Mr. Harper smiled, as if he had been waiting for someone to ask that exact question. "This piano was built by a man named Alastair Rowden over 90 years ago. He wasn't just a piano maker, he was an artist. He made only a few instruments in his lifetime, each by hand. They were rare then and they're priceless now." Emily blinked, surprised. "Priceless?" "Well," he chuckled, "valuable enough that collectors would pay a small fortune for one. But this piano never left Willow Creek." "Why not?" Emily asked. "Because it was a gift," he explained. "Rowden donated it to the town when the hall was built, in exchange for nothing. He believed music belonged to everyone, not just people who could afford it." Emily looked at the piano with new eyes. She had always known it was special, but she never imagined it might be worth more than the entire building. "Could it still be valuable today?" she asked breathlessly. Mr. Harper nodded. "If restored properly, it would draw attention. Museums, collectors, donors, they'd all be interested. People travel to hear instruments like this." A spark lit inside Emily's mind. She didn't just see an old piano anymore, she saw opportunity. She saw something that could change everything. "But it's in terrible shape," she said. "The strings are loose, the keys are worn, the wood is damaged." "True," Mr. Harper agreed, "but not impossible to fix. It needs a professional restorer, someone with skill. It would cost money, but if you manage to fix it, the piano could become the star of a fundraising performance. Something big, something that brings people from outside the town." Emily's heart raced. "A performance," she whispered, already imagining it. "A concert with the restored piano, people coming from other towns, donors hearing its story. The hall filled with music again." Mr. Harper leaned closer. "People laughed at you for saying you could save this place. They think you're dreaming, but if you show them something worth believing in, they'll stop laughing." The words filled her with courage. She spent the rest of the day carefully examining the piano, taking notes, searching online for information about restorers and estimating costs. It would not be cheap. It would take time, effort, and every bit of determination she had. But for the first time, she had a plan, something real, something she could fight for. In the days that followed, Emily met with a few locals who still cared about the hall. Some offered small donations, some helped her clean the hall, but many still thought she was chasing an impossible dream. They said it kindly, but the message was clear. "There isn't enough time. You're trying too late." But Emily didn't listen this time. She believed in the piano. She believed in its story. And most of all, she believed that people could be inspired if they were given something beautiful to believe in. She spent long hours polishing the piano, even if she knew it needed more than cleaning. Every time she touched it, she felt connected to the past and hopeful for the future. She imagined opening the doors to a hall full of people, hearing notes that hadn't been played in decades, and watching faces change as the sound filled the room. The piano wasn't just wood and strings. It was proof that art could last longer than buildings, longer than memories, longer than fear. It had been sleeping, not finished. And Emily promised herself she would help it wake up, no matter what anyone said. Because sometimes, saving something starts with finding the hidden value others stopped seeing. The next morning, Emily woke up before sunrise, her mind already busy with thoughts of the piano and the plan she had started building. She knew the restoration would cost more money than she had ever handled in her life. She also knew she had less than 3 weeks until the auction. Time felt like a clock loudly ticking in her ear. She sat at her small kitchen table, made a list of what needed to be done, and felt overwhelmed. She didn't just need money, she needed help, hands, support, and a little bit of luck. But she reminded herself that giving up wasn't an option. She had made a promise not just to the town, but to herself. The first thing she did was call piano restorers. Most didn't even answer. Some said they were too busy. Others said they could help, but not in such a short time. One man quoted a price so high that Emily almost dropped her phone. When she explained her situation, he said kindly, "I love what you're trying to do, but you need a miracle, not a technician." Emily thanked him anyway. She wasn't angry, she was just scared. She didn't know where a miracle would come from, but she believed the piano deserved a chance. Next, she began writing letters and emails. She wrote to musicians, music schools, arts foundations, and organizations that support historic buildings. She spent hours trying to explain why the town hall mattered and how the piano could make a difference. The town hall mattered and how the piano could make a difference. At first, she expected fast replies. Instead, she got silence. A day passed. 2 days, 3. Every refresh of her phone brought nothing new. It was discouraging, but she told herself that hope sometimes traveled slowly. Meanwhile, she started cleaning the hall with a group of volunteers. They were mostly young people, students who used to take lessons from her or loved music enough to help. They wiped dust, swept floors, washed windows, and carried away broken chairs. Some worked because they believed in her. Some worked because they believed in the building. Others simply enjoyed having something meaningful to do. The older townspeople watched from a distance. They admired her spirit but didn't want to get involved in something they believed would fail. "We've seen too many plans collapse," one woman said. "We don't want to be disappointed again." Emily understood. Life had made people careful with hope. In the middle of all this work, she received a call from a music professor in a nearby city. He said he had heard about the piano years earlier and knew its value. When she told him about her plan, he said, "Restoring it in 3 weeks is impossible, but performing with it as is could still be powerful." People love stories of old things being reborn. The idea stayed with her. Maybe she didn't need the piano to be perfect. Maybe she just needed it to speak. 1 week passed, and she still hadn't raised enough money to even begin restoration. She held a small community fundraiser outside the hall, selling baked goods and homemade crafts. People came, bought things, and cheered her on, but the amount collected was tiny compared to what she needed. It felt like trying to fill a lake with a spoon. One night, tired and frustrated, she sat alone on the piano bench, staring at the silent keys. She pressed one gently. The sound came out dull but honest. She whispered, "How am I supposed to save you when I can barely save myself?" She cried a little, not loudly, just quiet tears of exhaustion. But when she finished crying, she felt lighter. She reminded herself that this was never supposed to be easy. If it were easy, someone else would have done it years ago. She decided to use everything she had, her music, her students, her voice, and her story. She organized a small outdoor performance in the town square for the coming Saturday. She invited children and teens to play music, sing, and perform. She spread the word online, on posters and door-to-door. People were curious. Some laughed again, saying, "A concert can't save a building." But others said, "Well, at least she's trying." The day of the performance arrived, and the square filled with townspeople holding hot coffee in cold hands. The young performers stood nervously in a line. Emily, wearing a scarf and a determined smile, encouraged them softly, "Just do your best. Music doesn't have to be perfect to matter." When the first student played, the sound was uneven and shaky, but people clapped. When another child sang, the audience smiled. Bit by bit, the mood changed. The cold air felt warmer, faces softened, children laughed. Emily spoke to the crowd, telling the story of the piano, the craftsman who made it, and the hall that had been the town's heart. She explained her dream not as a miracle but as a request. "Help me bring music back here, even if just once. Help me remind people that we matter." People donated. Some gave coins, some gave bills, some gave checks. It was still not enough, but it was more than she had before. More importantly, people stopped laughing. They started hoping. When the performance ended, one parent whispered, "It was nice to see the town alive again." A teenager said, "I didn't know this place ever had music." That night, Emily counted the money, surprised by the generosity. But more than the amount, she felt the beginning of something shifting. Her plan was still risky. She still didn't have enough time or enough money. But she had momentum, and momentum was a kind of magic. In the days that followed, she worked harder. She practiced songs, rehearsed students, cleaned the hall, wrote more emails, and contacted more donors. She slept little and worried a lot, but she never stopped moving. People were still doubtful, some still whispered behind her back, some still thought she was doing all this only to fail. But she didn't care anymore. She wasn't trying to convince everyone. She was trying to build something worth believing in. And even though the deadline was getting closer, Emily knew one thing for sure. As long as she kept going, the story wasn't over yet. The morning of the auction arrived faster than Emily ever imagined. It felt as if the days had run past her, not walked. For 3 weeks she had lived in a blur of planning, cleaning, rehearsing, begging, hoping, and fighting against time. Now everything came down to this one day. If she failed, the hall would be sold. If she succeeded even barely, she might save it. She woke up before dawn, hands shaking, heart pounding. Outside her window, the town looked silent and half asleep, not yet aware of the battle that would take place. The air felt cold, as if it were waiting too. Emily dressed carefully, not in anything fancy, but in something that made her feel confident. She tied her hair back, put on a long coat, and took a deep breath before leaving home. She carried nothing except her sheet music and a belief that had refused to die, no matter how tired she became. When she arrived at the town hall, she saw cars parked outside, expensive ones, shiny, clean, unfamiliar to Willow Creek. The bidders were already there, business owners, investors, strangers with money to spend. They stood in small groups, drinking coffee from tall cups, speaking in low voices, studying papers and numbers. None of them looked at the building with love. They looked at it like a piece of land. Inside, the hall had been cleaned, though it still looked old and worn. The piano stood at the center of the stage, polished as much as possible, its scratches hidden by soft light. It still wasn't restored, and its sound would not be perfect. But Emily hoped that its imperfections would make it more emotional, not less. Volunteers moved around quickly, arranging chairs, checking microphones, greeting guests nervously. Students who had helped her were dressed nicely, excited but tense. They whispered to each other, trying to hide their fear. They knew what this day meant to Emily. The auctioneer, a tall man with a loud voice, greeted Emily with polite confusion. "You're sure you want to do this before we start?" he asked. "There's not much time." "I know," she replied. "I just need 10 minutes. He shrugged. To him, it didn't matter. Either way, the building would be sold. He wasn't cruel, just practical. People began to take their seats. Some didn't even realize there would be a performance. They sat with papers on their laps, ready to bid on something they knew little about. Many residents of Willow Creek also filled the hall, their faces a mix of hope and worry. They were not wealthy and could not buy the hall themselves, but they came because they wanted to witness whatever would happen. When the lights dimmed, Emily stepped onto the stage. She felt her knees weaken, but she stood tall. She didn't welcome the audience or explain anything. She didn't want to turn this into a speech. She simply sat down and placed her hands on the keys. The first note she played was soft, so soft that people leaned forward without meaning to. It wasn't perfect. It was slightly out of tune, but it had a voice, fragile and real. She began to play a piece she had practiced for days, emotional, slow, full of sadness, but also full of hope. The sound of the piano filled the hall like water finding its way into cracks. It spread, gentle but powerful. People stopped whispering. Even the auctioneer lowered his papers. Emily played with everything she had. Every memory, every fear, every dream poured into the music. She wasn't performing for applause. She was performing to remind people why saving something mattered. The piano responded like a tired friend trying its best. Some notes were warm, some were broken, but together they created something honest, raw, human. A woman in the crowd wiped her eyes without noticing. A man who had been laughing earlier now watched silently. Even the wealthy bidders stopped looking at numbers and looked at the stage instead. Halfway through the piece, Emily felt something shift. The hall didn't seem old anymore. It felt alive. It felt full. It didn't matter that the paint was chipped or the lights were dim. What mattered was the connection between music and people, just like before. When she reached the final chords, she played them slowly, letting each note fall like a drop of rain on dry ground. When the last sound faded, there was a long moment of silence. A true, heavy, stunned silence. Emily lifted her hands, breathing hard. She didn't look up right away. She wasn't sure she could handle the disappointment if people reacted badly. She had given everything she had. If it wasn't enough, she didn't know what she would do. Then someone started clapping, slowly at first, then faster. Then more people joined until the room was filled with applause, not polite claps, deep, emotional claps full of feeling. Emily looked out and saw faces changed, eyes softened. Hearts shifted. The auctioneer didn't raise his voice or open the bidding sheet. He simply stood still, watching the crowd, letting the moment settle. It was the first time in his career that he paused before doing his job, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. For a few seconds, no one in the room thought about money, business, or profit. They thought about what the hall meant, what the piano meant, what music meant. Emily rose from the bench, not with pride, but with relief. She didn't know if she had won anything yet, not money, not donors, not time, but she knew she had changed something. She had broken through the silence that had trapped the hall for years. She had silenced the auctioneer, not with force, but with music. Outside the hall, the sun was rising brighter than it had in weeks. Inside, the story was no longer about a dying building. It was about a girl, a piano, and a moment that reminded everyone that some things can be saved, not with power, but with heart. For a moment after the applause ended, no one knew what to do. People sat in their chairs, looking around at one another, unsure whether they should speak, cry, or simply sit quietly and hold on to what they had just felt. The hall, which had been empty for so long, now felt full of something invisible but powerful, hope maybe, or memory. Emily stood beside the piano, breathing slowly, trying to calm her shaking hands. She didn't smile wide or bow dramatically. She simply nodded, grateful that people had listened with their hearts open. She had expected polite clapping, maybe some supportive cheers from her students. But this felt different. This felt like something important had shifted inside the room. The auctioneer eventually cleared his throat, as if waking from a dream. He looked at his papers, then looked at the audience, then looked at Emily. For the first time that day, he seemed unsure of himself. Something about the music had taken command of the room, and it wasn't easy to go back to business. Just as he was about to begin the auction, a voice called from the back of the hall. "I'd like to donate $20,000 to help restore the building." Heads turned so quickly that chairs squeaked. A tall man in a dark coat stood up, serious-faced but clearly moved. No one recognized him, but everyone stared. Emily blinked, unable to speak. $20,000, that was more than she had raised in weeks. She opened her mouth, but before she could thank him, another voice spoke. "I'll match that donation." What? This time it was a woman, elegant, confident. She held her phone in one hand as if she had made the decision in a single, sudden moment. Gasps filled the room. People turned to each other, whispering, "Did she say match? Is this real? What's happening?" Emily felt dizzy. $40,000 in less than a minute. Her brain struggled to understand it. She had imagined that maybe someone would help her, but she never dreamed of numbers that large. The auctioneer tried to speak, but couldn't get a word out before another hand went up. "I'll donate $5 to help with repairs," an older woman said, the same woman who had laughed during the meeting weeks ago. Her voice trembled. "Not much, but I want to help." Then someone else stood, "Put me down for $1,000. Another raised a hand, $2,000. A teenager shouted from the front row, "I have $50. People laughed kindly, warmly, and someone clapped just for him. In a matter of minutes, money was coming from everywhere. Not just from wealthy strangers, but from local families who had nothing extra to give but gave anyway. People weren't donating because they were rich. They were donating because Emily's performance had reminded them of something they had forgotten. The town was worth saving. Emily had tears in her eyes now, but she forced herself to stay steady. She didn't want to cry in front of everyone, especially not in a moment like this. She felt her heart expanding with gratitude, fear, disbelief, joy, all mixed together like a strange but beautiful storm. At the far side of the room, a man in a suit stood up slowly. He waited for the murmurs to die down before speaking. "I'm from the Evergreen Preservation Foundation," he said calmly. "We fund historical and cultural restoration projects across the state. I came today because I heard a rumor this place had something worth seeing." All attention turned to him. Even the wealthy donors who had just offered thousands sat straighter. "I didn't expect a concert," he continued. "I didn't expect an audience. I certainly didn't expect to feel moved, but I did." What? He paused and looked directly at Emily. "You reminded us that history is not just a building, it's the stories people carry. You gave this place a voice again." Emily swallowed hard. She didn't dare speak. The man took a breath. "If the community raises even half of what is needed, our foundation will cover the rest." The room exploded, not with cheering at first, but with stunned disbelief. People stared at him as though they hadn't heard correctly. The mayor, who had been silent until now, stood up, shaking his head in amazement. "Sir, do you mean you'll match what's missing?" "Yes," the man replied, "we will match all remaining funds." Children shouted, adults gasped, someone clapped. Someone else laughed, someone hugged a stranger. Emily felt her knees weaken. The students rushed to her side, catching her arm, afraid she might fall. She laughed through tears, overwhelmed. The auctioneer lowered his gavel. "Well," he said quietly, "I guess we're not selling the building today." The audience erupted in applause again, louder this time, brighter, joyful. People stood, hugging, shaking hands, as though they had just won a battle together. Emily didn't feel like a hero. She didn't feel powerful. She just felt relieved, grateful, amazed at how quickly things could change when people chose hope over despair. The wealthy donors came forward to introduce themselves. They weren't cold or distant. They were warm, emotional, honest. Each of them had a story for why they cared: parents who loved music, childhoods spent in small towns, lives changed by art. It wasn't just money they offered, it was faith. A girl tugged Emily's sleeve and whispered, "I knew you could do it." Emily smiled and whispered back, "I didn't do it alone." For years, Willow Creek had been a place where people believed nothing good would happen anymore. But that day, in that hall, something extraordinary happened, not because of perfect buildings or perfect music, but because one person believed loudly enough to make others listen. The money wasn't completely raised yet, and there was still work to do, but the hardest part was over. People were no longer laughing at Emily. They were standing with her. In the days that followed the auction, the town of Willow Creek felt different, as if the air itself had become lighter. People walked with more energy, smiled more easily, and greeted each other with a sense of connection that had been missing for a long time. The announcement that the hall was safe from being sold spread quickly, and for the first time in years, the town had good news worth talking about. Emily, who had spent weeks running from one task to another, woke up the morning after the auction feeling strange. For the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't have to fight. She didn't have to convince, beg, or persuade anyone. The building was safe. The funding was coming. The impossible had been turned into something real. But the work was far from over. Within a few days, architects, contractors, and restoration experts visited the hall to evaluate its condition. They walked through each room, taking notes, measuring walls, tapping floors, and talking about structure, foundation, and safety. Some of their words sounded scary: water damage, electrical issues, rotten beams, but none of them said the building couldn't be saved. The Restoration Foundation sent a representative who shook Emily's hand and said, "Thank you for saving something worth saving." She didn't quite know how to respond. She wasn't used to compliments of that size. She simply smiled and said, "I didn't do it alone." And that was true. Every dollar, every hour of volunteering, every small act of kindness had built something larger than any single person. The townspeople who had once laughed at Emily's bold promise now looked at her with respect. Some apologized for doubting her. Others quietly avoided admitting they had ever laughed at her at all. But Emily didn't carry anger or pride. She was simply grateful that people had changed their minds before it was too late. The hall closed temporarily for repairs, and during those months, Willow Creek found itself buzzing with excitement. People drove by just to peek at the construction, shaking their heads in disbelief that this was actually happening. Local shops began selling items with the hall's image printed on them: mugs, postcards, tote bags, t-shirts, with slogans like "We saved it" and "Where music lives." For many, the hall became a symbol of something bigger than a single building. It represented community, memory, and the power of believing in impossible things. It reminded people that they hadn't always been tired, hopeless, or silent, that once they had been a town that celebrated, cheered, danced, and dreamed. Meanwhile, the grand piano received attention from a skilled restorer sent by the foundation. He spent weeks cleaning, repairing, tuning, and bringing back its original voice. Every time Emily visited, she saw it looking a little better: shinier wood, smoother keys, strings with fresh tension. The craftsman explained that this piano wasn't just old. It was rare, built with techniques that no one used anymore. "It deserves to be heard," he told her. When the hall was finally ready to reopen, nearly a year had passed. The building looked different but familiar: new paint, strong beams, polished floors, bright lights. The walls were still the same, but they no longer held sadness. They held potential. On the night of the reopening, the entire town gathered outside, dressed in their best clothes despite the cold air. For some, it felt like a holiday. For others, it felt like a reunion with an old friend. Children pointed excitedly at the lights. Teenagers took photos. Adults hugged one another without embarrassment. The mayor gave a short speech thanking everyone for their help, but everyone knew who they were thinking of. When he called Emily to the stage, she felt nervous again, just as she had the day of the auction. But this time, she wasn't standing alone. Behind her stood volunteers, donors, musicians, and friends. Emily didn't give a long speech. She simply said, "Thank you for believing. Thank you for proving that we are a community worth saving." The crowd clapped, some wiping away tears. Then, the moment everyone had been waiting for arrived. The newly restored piano was rolled onto the center of the stage. It looked beautiful: shining black surface, ivory keys, and a quiet confidence, like a survivor ready to sing again. Emily sat down and played the same piece she had played on the day of the auction. This time, the piano did not sound tired or broken. It sounded strong, rich, and full of life. The notes flowed through the hall, touching the walls, filling the air, reaching every ear and every heart. People listened in silence, remembering what had almost been lost and feeling grateful for what had been saved. Some thought about the past, others dreamed about the future. Some cried quietly, unable to explain why. When the music ended, the audience stood and applauded, not just for Emily, but for the moment, the building, the journey, and the reminder that change was possible. The piano didn't just silence an auctioneer, it brought a town back to life. In the months that followed, the hall once again became a place of laughter, music, meetings, weddings, plays, and celebrations. Students performed there, families decorated it, seniors danced there. Musicians from other towns came to play, curious about the piano with the story that traveled ahead of it. And every time someone asked how it happened, people smiled and said, "Because someone believed when no one else did." Emily didn't seek fame or reward. She continued teaching music quietly and joyfully. But whenever she walked into the hall and saw the piano waiting, she remembered the day she said, "I can save it," and people laughed. Now no one laughed anymore, they listened, and they believed. No one laughed anymore, they listened, and they believed.